The air inside the Royal Albert Hall in London carried a quiet hum that was different from any other evening. The hall had seen countless performances, but tonight felt set apart. It was a charity concert to raise funds for music programs for children in war-torn countries. The audience filled every red velvet seat, the golden balconies shimmering softly under the chandeliers. Reporters sat among dignitaries, musicians, and patrons of the arts. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and introduced the next performer. The applause was polite, respectful. Then a man emerged from the side stage. His walk was steady but careful. His silver hair caught the light, and the lines on his face spoke of decades lived in both triumph and loss. William Anderson, 76 years old, a self-made American millionaire, whose name had become synonymous with the largest music foundation in the United States. He was not wearing a tuxedo like most performers. Instead, a simple dark suit hung loosely from his tall frame. In his right hand, he carried a violin. The wood was scratched and faded, its varnish dulled by time. The audience could sense it was not an ordinary instrument, and perhaps not an ordinary performance. William reached the center of the stage and looked out over the silent hall. He adjusted the microphone stand, leaning slightly closer. His voice was lower than the room expected, but steady. "This piece is not new," he began. It was born in the spring of 1944 in a small cafe in London. It was written by two young people who thought they had time. We did not. War took that away. Tonight, I play it for her wherever she is, and for every dream cut short by war. The crowd did not know who he was talking about. They only saw a man with a violin and the kind of pause in his voice that made them lean forward. He nodded once to himself, placed the violin under his chin, and lifted the bow. In the fourth row of the central section, among invited guests and honorary judges of the evening's youth competition, an elderly woman sat motionless. Her name was Elizabeth Carter, though everyone here knew her as Liz, the retired head of the Royal Conservatory's piano department. Her white hair was styled simply, her navy dress unadorned. She had agreed to attend tonight because a former student had insisted. She had no idea who else would be on the program. But when William walked out holding that violin, she froze. Her heart jolted against her ribs. The violin was not just any old instrument. She knew the exact curve of its scroll, the worn edge near the chin rest. And the title the Master of Ceremonies had spoken earlier still echoed in her mind. Summer's Promise. It could not be. She had told herself that name belonged only to her memories. The notes they had written together were buried with the boy she had loved. The boy she believed had died in Normandy before he ever turned 19. Yet here stood a man decades older, bow in hand, about to play those notes. Liz pressed her hand against the silk scarf around her neck, as if to steady herself. She could not look away from the stage. William lowered the bow to the strings. The first note rose clear but softened by age, and something deeper. It was the same opening phrase she had heard in that cafe nearly 60 years ago, when the outside world shook with distant explosions. It was the melody they had shaped together during stolen afternoons, between air raid sirens and hurried cups of tea. The sound filled the hall. The audience listened with the kind of attention usually given to a farewell. Each note seemed to carry weight, as if drawn from the marrow of the man playing. His right arm moved carefully, almost guarded, and anyone watching closely could see a tightness in his shoulder. Yet the music never broke. Liz felt her eyes sting. She was back in that smoky London cafe, 17 years old, watching an American soldier take out his violin and ask if he could join her at the piano. She remembered his shy smile, the way his accent made her laugh, and the thrill of creating something together that felt like a secret world of their own. Now, decades later, that world had cracked open again in the middle of a grand hall. She leaned forward slightly, unable to stop herself. Her lips parted as though she might call his name, but no sound came out. On stage, William reached the first swell of the piece, the point where the violin soared above the imagined piano. His brow furrowed with concentration. He knew this was the only time he would play it for an audience. His right shoulder burned with the familiar ache that had followed him since 1944, but he ignored it. This was not for technique. This was for her. As the last note faded into the rafters, the silence in the hall held for a moment longer than applause normally allows. Then the clapping began growing into a standing ovation. William lowered the violin, nodded once in gratitude, and left the stage the way he had entered without flourish. Liz remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The ovation blurred around her. She had come tonight expecting an evening of polite performances and perhaps a few familiar faces. She had not expected a ghost to walk out onto the stage and bring with him the sound of a promise made in another lifetime. Her breath caught. She was not sure if the man she had just seen was truly William Anderson, the boy who had once saved her from a collapsing wall during a bombing raid, the boy whose letters she had never received after the summer of 1944. But her heart told her it was. And if it was him, then everything she had believed about the past might not be the whole truth. She sat back slowly, her eyes fixed on the side door where he had disappeared, her pulse unsteady. The concert moved on, but for Liz, time had tilted. Somewhere backstage, a man with silver hair and a weathered violin had just played their song. She needed to know if her William had returned. Spring of 1944 in London did not feel like spring at all. The air was cold and damp heavy, with the smell of coal smoke and the metallic tang of fear. Streets bore the marks of previous raids. Some buildings patched clumsily, others left as hollow shells. For 18-year-old Private William Anderson, newly arrived from America, the city was a strange mix of resilience and exhaustion. His unit was stationed on the outskirts waiting for orders that would eventually send them across the channel to Normandy. Those days were filled with drills, maintenance, and the constant readiness that made every hour feel borrowed. On a rare afternoon off duty, William wandered into the city. He carried his violin in its scuffed case, more out of habit than expectation, using it as a reminder of the life he once imagined before uniforms and rifles. The rain began, without warning, cold drops spattering the pavement. He ducked into the first doorway. He found a narrow cafe with fogged windows and the faint scent of tea leaves and baked bread. Inside, a small upright piano sat against the far wall. A young woman was seated there, her back straight, her fingers gliding over the keys with a quiet confidence. She was playing Clair de Lune, and the melody filled the cramped space as if it had been waiting for someone to listen. William stood near the door for a moment, unwilling to interrupt. The music was delicate but unafraid, and there was something in her posture that made him think she had learned to play in the dark with only her own resolve to guide her. When she finished the piece, he approached the counter, ordered a cup of tea, and then almost without thinking, walked toward the piano. "That was beautiful," he said, his American accent, making her look up with mild curiosity. "Thank you," she replied simply. He noticed the fine smudge of graphite on her fingertips, the faint wear on the keys where her hands had lingered. She told him her name was Elizabeth Carter, though she preferred Liz. She lived with her parents nearby and was preparing for her entrance audition to the Royal Conservatory where she hoped to study piano. When she asked about him, he hesitated before answering. "Just a soldier waiting for orders," he said. Then lifting the violin case, he added, "and sometimes a musician." She tilted her head with a faint smile. "Sometimes war doesn't exactly leave much room for recitals," he said. There was no challenge in her expression, only quiet interest. "Would you play something with me?" she asked. They found a song, both knew a simple standard, and as soon as his bow touched the strings, the cafe seemed to shrink around them. Her piano was the steady ground, his violin, the thread of light above it. They did not speak until the last note faded, and when they did, it was to ask what else they might play together. Over the next weeks, William found excuses to come into the city. Sometimes he was drenched from the rain, sometimes dusted with the grime of training exercises, but Liz never seemed to mind. They played everything from classical pieces to improvised melodies, their ease together growing until words were often unnecessary. One afternoon, between the steady thump of distant artillery, William suggested they write something of their own. "It doesn't have to be long," he said, "just ours." Liz agreed, and they began shaping a melody in the key of G, one that rose like the morning and lingered like the last light before nightfall. He called it Summer's Promise because the name made him think of something worth waiting for. In the cramped back room of the cafe, they worked through each phrase. William would hum a line, and Liz would answer with chords, adjusting until they both nodded. It was not polished, but it felt alive. On good days, they could almost forget the war pressing against the city's edges. There were moments when William caught her watching him, a glint in her eyes that was not quite curiosity anymore. He thought of telling her how he felt, but each time the words rose, he pushed them back down, telling himself there would be time later. One night, an air raid siren cut their meeting short. They ran together into the nearest shelter, the low ceiling dripping with condensation, the air thick with fear. In the dim light, she reached for his hand without hesitation. They stayed like that until the all-clear sounded. When they emerged, he told himself that after Normandy he would give her the small silver key he carried in his pocket, the one he had bought from a street vendor near the docks. He imagined telling her it was the key to their future, a promise they would unlock together when the war was done. For now they kept meeting, filling sheet after sheet with music in pencil smudges and ink blots. The melody had a quiet resilience, like the city itself. And though neither spoke the words aloud, they both knew it was a score, written with more than notes. It was a fragile bridge across a world falling apart, a bridge they both wanted to cross. The weeks that followed took on a strange rhythm. Some days William's duties kept him confined to the barracks cleaning rifles or running drills, until his muscles ached, but whenever he was granted leave, he found his way back to that small cafe on the corner street where Liz spent most afternoons. The owner, a kindly widow named Mrs. Hale, quickly grew used to the sight of the tall American with the violin case and the young Englishwoman at the piano. She would bring them tea without asking, sometimes with 2 slices of bread and jam if the rationing allowed. Outside London carried on its weary routine, but inside those walls there was a small pocket of normalcy that neither of them wanted to disturb. They began to speak more openly, though never about feelings. William told Liz about his childhood in Ohio, where summers smelled of fresh hay and rain on the cornfields, and about the music teacher who had given him her husband's old violin. When she realized he had no instrument of his own, Liz told him about learning piano on the battered upright her father had bought before she was born, about playing for her younger brothers before they were evacuated to the countryside. They discovered they both loved simple folk tunes as much as they loved Bach, that they both believed music had a way of making even the ugliest moments bearable. In the quiet between songs, they would share bits of themselves that seemed too delicate for the outside world. One late afternoon, a sudden barrage of bombs fell close enough to rattle the window panes. Mrs. Hale shouted for everyone to get to the shelter. William grabbed Liz's hand and pulled her toward the narrow stairs leading underground. The air in the shelter was heavy with damp and fear. People pressed together on wooden benches, murmuring prayers under their breath. In that cramped space, Liz leaned into him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. He could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the warmth of her hand in his was enough to make the noise above fade for a moment. When the all-clear finally came, they climbed back into the cafe, which had somehow escaped damage. Liz sat at the piano again, her hands trembling slightly, and played a slow, calming melody. Without a word, William joined in, the violin's voice weaving around hers until the last note faded into the soft patter of rain. Their piece, Summer's Promise, was beginning to take shape. Each meeting added new layers, a rising phrase here, a subtle key change there, until the score was no longer just music. It was the story of their shared days, the uncertainty, the fleeting joy, the stubborn hope. William began carrying a small notebook in his pocket to jot down ideas between patrols. Liz would write out chords on scraps of paper and slip them to him when they met, her eyes lighting up whenever he tried them on the violin. As the composition grew, so did the unspoken understanding between them. One evening, William arrived, late still in uniform mud, clinging to his boots. Liz was already at the piano, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening immediately. "I was beginning to think you'd been sent away," she said. "Not yet," he replied, setting down his case. He did not add that his orders could come at any moment. They played until Mrs. Hale announced she was closing for the night. Outside, the sky was clear, for once the moon casting a pale light over the cobblestones. William walked Liz to her street, stopping at the corner where he could see the light in her window. "Good night, Liz," he said, and for a moment he almost reached into his pocket for the small silver key. But he held back. Not yet. The following week brought news of heavier raids expected over the city. They met earlier in the day, determined to finish the central movement of their piece before circumstances pulled them apart. William adjusted the bow in his hand, watching her fingers move over the keys with a mix of precision and grace. At one point, she caught him looking and laughed softly. "What is it, just thinking?" he said. "About what?" "About how this is the only part of the day that feels real." She met his gaze for a moment before returning to the keys, her cheeks faintly flushed. In the final bars they worked on that day, the melody swelled into something brighter, as if they both wanted to believe there would be a future where they could play it without fear. They promised to meet the next afternoon to continue. As William left the cafe, the small key in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He told himself that tomorrow he would give it to her, that tomorrow he would say what he had been holding back. He did not know that tomorrow would not come as he imagined. The next day began with the low growl of aircraft engines somewhere above the city, a sound that had become so common that most Londoners no longer froze when they heard it. William finished his morning duties at the barracks and checked the small watch on his wrist. It was just past 1 o'clock. If he left now, he could make it to the cafe by mid-afternoon and work with Liz on the final section of Summer's Promise. He slipped the silver key into his breast pocket, the chain coiled neatly, and tightened the strap on his violin case. The walk into the city was quieter than usual, though the air held the tense heaviness of weather about to turn. As he reached the familiar street, the first thing he noticed was the smoke. It rose in thick, twisting plumes from a block away, and the sharp smell of burning wood and brick dust stung his nose. His pace quickened. Turning the corner, he stopped cold. The cafe was gone. Where the windows had once steamed with the scent of tea and bread, there was only a jagged ruin, the roof collapsed inward, blackened beams jutting out like broken ribs. Civil defense volunteers moved among the debris, their faces streaked with soot. A fire engine sprayed the last of the smoldering wood. William's chest tightened as he searched the crowd for Liz. He approached one of the volunteers, a middle-aged man with a grim set to his mouth. The people inside William asked. The man shook his head. "We've pulled a few out. Some gone to hospital, some—" His voice trailed off. A young woman, dark hair, about 17, plays the piano William pressed. The man flipped through a small notepad. No name like that on the evac list. But there are still missing. And there was a direct hit on the flats nearby. William felt the world tilt. "Do you know where the survivors were taken?" The man gave an address of a local hospital. William went there immediately, but the corridors were filled with chaos. Nurses moved briskly between rows of cots. He scanned every face he could see, but none belonged to Liz. Finally, a nurse at the desk told him there was no one by that name, admitted but that some victims were too badly injured to be identified yet. His leave time was nearly over. Orders had come down that his unit would ship out within days for the Normandy invasion. He asked his commanding officer for more time to search, but was told in clipped tones that there was no flexibility. That night, one of the medics he knew quietly handed him a sheet of paper. It was an unofficial casualty list compiled from several districts. Halfway down the page, next to Elizabeth Carter, the word missing was marked with a small cross, the notation often used when someone was presumed dead. William stared at it for a long moment. He folded the paper, carefully placed it in his pocket next to the key, and lay back on his cot, staring at the dark ceiling. He told himself there was still a chance, but in the deepest part of him, the belief had already broken. 2 days later, he was on a ship bound for France. In the chaos of Normandy, there was no time for music. The first weeks were a blur of noise mud, and orders barked above the sound of gunfire. Then came the day a mortar round exploded near his position, sending a shard of metal tearing into his right shoulder and upper arm. The pain was white hot, and when he woke in the field hospital, his arm was bound tightly, his hand numb. The doctor told him he was lucky it had not been worse. "You'll have strength again," the man said, "but you may never get rid of the pain. Heavy use will make it flare up." William nodded, but the words settled over him like a verdict. He was evacuated to a recovery ward in southern England where weeks turned into months. Letters from home trickled in, but none from Liz. When he was finally sent back to the United States, the war was grinding on, and he told himself that whatever had connected them had been buried in that pile of rubble in London. What William did not know was that Liz had survived the bombing. She had been in the flat above the cafe when the first blast shook the street, and the fire that followed trapped her until neighbors pulled her out through a back alley. Her injuries were not life-threatening, but the shock left her fevered and disoriented for days. By the time she asked about William, Mrs. Hale's sister, who had visited the barracks to inquire, returned with the devastating news a young American soldier named William Anderson had died in Normandy shortly after the landings. No one could tell her exactly how the information had reached them, but in the swirl of rumors and half-truths that filled the city, it was accepted as fact. Liz carried that belief with her into the countryside where she went to live with an aunt. She kept the unfinished sheet music for Summer's Promise, folded in a small wooden box, unable to throw it away, but unable to bear looking at it for long. And so they both moved forward, each convinced the other had been claimed by the war, each holding on to the same piece of music as the only tangible proof that their days together had been real. When the war finally ended, William returned to Ohio with a chest full of medals and a shoulder that still ached whenever the weather turned cold. The violin case he carried home was scuffed from travel and bore a faint smell of salt from the Atlantic crossing. He set it on the table in his small apartment and left it closed for weeks. Every time he thought about opening it, the image of the cafe in ruins and the casualty list with Liz's name returned, pressing the air from his lungs. He tried to play again, but the sharp pull in his right arm made long sessions impossible, and without her there to complete the phrases, the music felt hollow. So he put the violin away and told himself he would focus on building something practical. What began as repairing instruments for a local shop grew into a business importing and selling violins, pianos, and sheet music. He had a knack for recognizing quality and an instinct for connecting with customers. Within a decade, Anderson Music Supply was one of the largest distributors in the region. As the years passed, expansion took him to other states, then across the country, and eventually into manufacturing. His name appeared in magazines, his photograph in business journals, but no interview ever touched on the fact that he lived alone. Friends introduced him to women they thought would suit him, but he always found a reason to decline. He told them his work left no time for marriage, but the truth was simpler and harder his heart had chosen once, and it would not choose again. Across the ocean, Liz built a quiet life in England. She recovered from her injuries, studied piano at a local conservatory when she could afford it, and later took a position teaching music to children. Her students adored her, but in the evenings after the last notes faded, she would sometimes take out the folded pages of Summer's Promise and trace the penciled lines with her fingertip. She imagined what the rest of it might have sounded like had they been given the chance to finish. She never married either. Offers came and went, but she carried the same unspoken reason William did, though she did not know they shared it. Decades slid by. William's business empire grew, and he turned much of his attention toward philanthropy. He funded music programs in schools, donated instruments to communities that had none, and established a foundation to support young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. His personal wealth became vast, but he kept a small apartment above the original shop where his work had started a reminder of more modest beginnings. The ache in his shoulder remained a constant companion, flaring whenever he tried to play for more than a few minutes. It became easier to hand the violin to someone else, to applaud from the audience, rather than step into the light himself. Liz, meanwhile, retired from full-time teaching in her early 70s, though she still gave private lessons. She spent her days reading, tending a small garden, and attending occasional performances at the Royal Conservatory, where she had once hoped to study. She was respected, even admired by those in the music community, but she avoided questions about her own past compositions. The subject felt like a room she could not enter without stirring ghosts. Both carried the weight of not knowing. William sometimes wondered if he had been too quick to accept the casualty report, if perhaps there had been a mistake, but each time the thought surfaced, he buried it. The war had claimed so many, and hope felt like a cruelty when it had nothing to stand on. Liz occasionally imagined that William might have survived Normandy, but the rumor of his death had been so persistent, so widely repeated, that to doubt it seemed foolish. And so the years became decades, their paths never crossing, though they lived in the same world of music. In two different countries, they attended events where they might have been in the same room without knowing, each unaware that the other's name still carried the same quiet ache. By the turn of the millennium, William was in his mid-70s. His foundation had funded hundreds of projects, and though he rarely performed, he still kept the old violin in perfect condition. One evening, as he sorted through some of his belongings, he found the sheet music for Summer's Promise, folded inside the case. The sight of it stirred something he had not felt in years. His hand hovered over the notes, and he traced the title in the corner, written in Liz's handwriting. The ache in his shoulder warned against it, but he set the bow to the strings and began to play the first measures. The sound was shaky at first, then steadier. When he reached the middle section, the one they had finished together, before the bombing, his throat tightened. He stopped and stared at the wall for a long time. That night, an idea began to form. The foundation could host a charity concert in London, the city where it had all begun. He would headline the event himself, playing Summer's Promise for the first time in nearly 6 decades. It would be a tribute to her, the girl who had given those notes life, and to the thousands of young musicians whose dreams were worth protecting from the violence of the world. He knew it would hurt to play, that his shoulder would resist every movement, but the thought of leaving the piece unfinished for the rest of his life felt heavier than the pain. In another part of London, Liz received an invitation to the same charity concert, sent by a former student who was now involved with the organizing committee. It was billed as a night of music to support children in war-affected regions, featuring distinguished performers from around the world. The headliner's name was listed simply as William Anderson. She did not notice it at first. Only when she glanced again at the program description did the name catch her attention. It meant nothing, she told herself. There must be countless William Andersons. Yet for the rest of the evening, the name refused to leave her mind. The night of the concert arrived with a crisp chill in the London air. The Royal Albert Hall glowed against the dark sky, its curved facade bathed in soft golden light. Inside, the audience took their seats, the murmured conversations blending into a low hum. Banners for the Anderson Music Foundation hung near the stage, each one carrying the slogan, "Bringing music where it is needed most." William stood in a small dressing room backstage, the old violin resting on the table in front of him. He flexed his right hand, slowly feeling the familiar twinge in his shoulder. The doctor had told him earlier in the week to keep his movements gentle, but he knew the piece would demand more. He looked at the sheet music, the penciled annotations faded, but still legible. He remembered the way Liz's handwriting had curved over the title, and how they had argued gently over a particular chord change. He had not altered it even now. A knock came at the door. One of the event coordinators leaned in, reminding him he would go on in 15 minutes. He nodded and lifted the violin, carefully adjusting the chin rest, as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. Out in the hall, Liz arrived with her former student, now a judge for the youth competition that was part of the evening's program. They had been given seats close to the stage. Liz had not recognized any names on the program, except the mysterious William Anderson, but she had pushed the thought aside. Now, as she settled into her seat, she glanced at the printed order of performances. The final piece was listed as Summer's Promise. Her breath caught. The name pulled her backward through the decades so abruptly she had to grip the armrest. She had never heard of anyone else using that title. The lights dimmed slightly as the master of ceremonies took the stage, speaking about the mission of the foundation and the importance of music in healing communities fractured by war. Then he introduced the final performer, a man whose life's work had brought instruments and training to thousands of young people. Please welcome William Anderson. Liz's eyes went to the side entrance. A tall man with silver hair walked slowly into the light, a violin in his right hand. Even from a distance, she saw the way he carried himself, the faint stiffness in his shoulder. Her heart began to pound. William reached the center of the stage, looked out over the audience, and spoke into the microphone. His voice was deeper than she remembered, but the cadence was unmistakable. This piece was written in London in 1944. It was never finished then. Tonight I will play it as it was meant to be for the person who inspired it, and for all whose voices were silenced before their time. Liz's hands tightened in her lap. Every word pushed against the belief she had held for almost 60 years. When he placed the violin under his chin and drew the bow across the strings, the first note struck her like a physical touch. It was theirs. The melody was exactly as they had left it, each phrase, carrying the echo of those afternoons, in the cafe of laughter between air raid sirens of promises never spoken aloud. William played with a mixture of precision and restraint, as though each note carried a memory too fragile to handle roughly. His right arm moved with careful control, betraying only the occasional flicker of discomfort when the music demanded more strength. The audience sat utterly still. Liz felt her vision blur with tears, but she refused to look away. She watched the set of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, when he reached the section that had been her favorite, the part where the violin seemed to lift the melody into a kind of fragile hope. As the final notes faded, the hall erupted into applause, the sound rolling toward the stage like a wave. William bowed slightly, acknowledging the ovation, then walked off stage without looking back. Liz sat frozen. Her student asked if she was all right, but she could not answer. She knew with absolute certainty now. The man she had believed gone for most of her life was alive and had just played their song. Backstage, William returned the violin to its case and let out a slow breath. The ache in his shoulder was sharp now, but it was overshadowed by a strange sense of completion. He had done what he came here to do. What he did not know was that in the audience, the woman for whom the piece had been written was already making her way toward the reception area, her heart hammering with a mix of dread and anticipation. The reception hall was filled with the warm glow of chandeliers, the hum of conversation, and the gentle clink of glasses. Guests moved between small tables, congratulating the young performers and exchanging polite pleasantries. At the far end of the room, William stood near a display showcasing photographs from the Foundation's projects. He listened with half an ear as a local donor praised his speech, his mind still lingering on the performance. Across the room, Liz entered quietly, her eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment she hesitated, unsure what she would say if she found him. The years had altered them both, yet her heart seemed to recognize him before her mind could reason it through. She saw him turn slightly, and the angle of his face struck her like a memory pulled from a dream. She began to walk toward him each step, making the air feel thinner. William was about to excuse himself when he noticed a figure moving with deliberate slowness in his direction. The sight made his breath falter. She was smaller than he remembered, her hair silvered, but her posture and the calm determination in her eyes were the same. He stared, unable to speak, as she came to a stop just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was Liz who broke the silence, her voice soft and uncertain. William. The sound of his name in her voice was enough to pull him back 60 years in an instant. His throat tightened, and for a second he could not trust himself to speak. Liz, he managed his voice low and unsteady. It's you. She nodded, tears already gathering. I thought you were gone. They told me you were killed. William swallowed hard, shaking his head slowly. And they told me you had died in the bombing. I searched after the war, but there was nothing. Your name wasn't anywhere. Then someone from my unit said they'd heard you were buried in London. Her breath trembled as she replied, I was in hospital for months. When I woke, my aunt told me you hadn't made it. I stopped looking because I thought there was nothing to find. They stood there, two people, bound by the same wound inflicted decades ago. William reached out his hand, hesitant, and she took it without hesitation. The touch was fragile but electric, a bridge across lost years. I never stopped thinking about you, he said. Every note I played tonight was for you. Liz's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. I knew. The moment you played the first phrase, I knew. A wave of emotion surged between them, too complex for words. Around them, the noise of the reception faded to a distant murmur. They spoke then of the years between, of lives lived in the shadow of what might have been. William told her of building the foundation, of finding purpose in giving music to others when he could no longer play as he once had. Liz spoke of teaching, of guiding countless students, even as her own music had been too painful to perform for many years. They laughed softly at small memories, the way he had once argued over the tempo of a single measure, the time she had dropped her pencil into the piano during rehearsal. But the laughter would always be followed by a pause, a moment of quiet in which the unspoken truth settled between them. The life they might have shared had been stolen by war. At last, William said, "I don't want to lose you again. Whatever time we have left, I want to spend it knowing you're there." Her eyes glistened as she replied, "Then we won't waste another day." A photographer for the event approached, asking if they would mind posing for a picture as part of the donor highlights. William glanced at Liz, silently asking for her consent. She gave a small nod, and they stood side by side, his hand gently over hers. The camera flash captured not just two elderly guests at a charity gala, but two souls reunited after a lifetime apart. When the photographer moved on, they remained standing together, neither in a hurry to let go. Somewhere in the background, the string quartet began to play a soft arrangement of a familiar wartime tune. Without thinking, William turned to her and said, "One day, if you're willing, I'd like us to play again, even if it's just for us." Liz smiled through her tears. "I'd like that very much." In that moment, the noise of the crowd returned. The reality of the years they had lost remained, but the ache that had defined so much of their lives was lighter. The war had taken nearly everything, but it had not taken the part of them that still recognized, still remembered, and still cared. A week later, the small concert hall of the local music school was prepared for an event that had not been announced to the public. The stage was modest, the seats filled with only a handful of students from Liz's classes, a few members of William's foundation, and some close friends. William stood in the wings, his violin in hand. The instrument was not the same one he had played in London in 1944, but it carried the same purpose. His fingers still ached when he held the bow for too long, but tonight the pain was a secondary thought. Liz was already seated at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, waiting for him. They had rehearsed only twice, and even then, they had spent more time talking than playing. Yet the music was familiar, not because of technical perfection, but because it belonged to them. William walked to the center of the stage, each step measured. The audience quieted. He took his place beside the piano and gave Liz a small nod. She returned it, her expression calm, yet filled with emotion. He lifted the violin, drew in a breath, and began. The opening notes were gentle, almost tentative, like the cautious steps of someone returning to a home long abandoned. Liz followed her chords, steady, warm, filling the room, with a sound that was both present and distant, like an echo from another life. The piece they played was the same unfinished composition from that morning in 1944. They had completed it together in the days since the gala, sitting in her small living room with sheets of paper scattered around them. Some measures had been altered, others left exactly as they had written them as teenagers. William's bow moved slowly at first, adjusting to the familiar discomfort in his arm. But the longer he played, the more the strain faded behind the force of memory and connection. Liz's playing was deliberate, her touch carrying both precision and tenderness. Their eyes met briefly above the music, and the years seemed to collapse in on themselves. For the audience, it was a beautiful duet. For them, it was a conversation across decades, a way of saying everything that had been left unsaid when the war tore them apart. Halfway through the music swelled the melody climbing, in a way that seemed to defy the weight of time. William felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he feared the emotion would overwhelm his ability to play. But then Liz's left hand struck a chord that anchored him, grounding him in the present. The final section was quiet, almost like a lullaby. When the last note faded, there was no immediate applause, only a long silence, as if the room itself was reluctant to disturb the moment. Then the clapping began gentle at first, then growing as people rose to their feet. William lowered his violin, his hand trembling slightly. Liz stood and stepped toward him. Without speaking, he took her hand and they bowed together. After the performance, as the small audience mingled, William and Liz found themselves alone near the stage. She smiled softly. "You played beautifully," she said. He shook his head lightly. "We played beautifully." She hesitated before adding, "I never thought I would hear that piece finished. I never thought I'd hear it with you." His voice was quiet. "I never thought I'd get the chance." They stood in the stillness of the emptying hall. The scent of polished wood and old sheet music lingered in the air. William looked at her with the kind of focus that carried both gratitude and longing. "Liz, I don't know how much time either of us has left, but I do know I want to spend it with you. No more lost years, no more wondering." She took a slow breath, then nodded. "Then we'll write the rest of our story together." Outside, the evening air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain. They walked side by side down the steps of the hall, their pace unhurried. Neither needed to speak. The silence between them was no longer heavy with absence, but light with possibility. William glanced at her, thinking of all the moments they had been denied, all the music they had not played, all the words they had never said. And yet here they were together, the melody not yet finished. As they reached the street, he offered her his arm. She took it, and they began to walk their steps in quiet harmony. Somewhere in the distance, a busker played a tune on a battered violin. William paused, listening. Liz smiled knowingly. "It's not perfect," she said. He smiled back. "Neither are we." And they kept walking, the sound of the music following them into the night.